accused of raping, impregnating, and killing his niece in 2018.
Now, Jonathan Quiles is charged with first-degree murder in 16-year-old Iyana Sawyer's death. Her body has not been found. News 4 Jax reporter Aaron Farrar is joining us now live outside the Duval County Courthouse this morning.
Lunch period had just begun at Terry Parker High School in Jacksonville, Florida. The halls were full of movement as students stepped outside to meet friends, grab food, or scroll through their phones before the next class. In the middle of that routine afternoon was 16-year-old Iyana Sawyer. She stood near the edge of campus, looking down at her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she typed out a message. A few seconds passed. Her phone buzzed with a reply. Iyana glanced toward the parking lot. Whatever she had just read seemed to settle something in her mind. She gathered the small bag she was carrying and began walking toward the curb. Students nearby barely noticed her leaving. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary moment, just another teenager stepping away from school during lunch. Then a car pulled up. The driver leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. Iyana hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. That was the last time anyone would ever see 16-year-old Iyana Sawyer alive. So the question is, why did she leave school that day? Who was waiting for her in that car? And what happened in the hours after she got inside? Because the person who picked her up wasn't a stranger. It was someone she knew. Someone her family trusted. The man behind the wheel was her uncle. And months later, when investigators uncovered the truth about the relationship between them, the discovery stunned everyone involved in the case. But before we get into the details, take a second to let me know where you're watching from around the world. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure you like the video and subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. Now, to understand how this story reached that moment in the school parking lot, we need to start with who Iyana Sawyer really was, and the secret she had been carrying in the months leading up to her disappearance. Before her name ever appeared in headlines or courtrooms, Iyana Sawyer was simply a teenager, trying to navigate life like so many others her age. She lived in Jacksonville, Florida, a large city where neighborhoods are filled with families, schools, and the everyday rhythm of work and home life. For Iyana, that rhythm mostly revolved around school, family, and the small circle of people she trusted. Those who knew her best remember a girl who could be quiet at first but warm once you got to know her. Friends described Iyana as someone who didn't seek attention but always showed kindness. She listened when others needed someone to talk to. She laughed easily around the people she felt comfortable with, and she cared deeply about those closest to her. Family members often talked about how polite and respectful she was growing up. She wasn't the type of teenager who constantly searched for trouble or conflict. Like many young people, she had moments of independence and curiosity about the world. But those who loved her say she still leaned heavily on her family for guidance and support. At home, Iyana was surrounded by relatives who were part of her everyday life. Family gatherings, holidays, and simple evenings together formed the backdrop of her childhood. People who spent time with her remember a girl who loved conversation and enjoyed being around the people she trusted most. School was another important part of Iyana's world. She attended Terry Parker High School in Jacksonville. Like thousands of other students across the country, her days were filled with classes, conversations in hallways, and plans about what life might look like after graduation. Teachers who interacted with her described a student who kept a relatively low profile, but showed respect in the classroom. She wasn't known as someone who disrupted lessons or created problems. Instead, she moved quietly through her school day, focused on her responsibilities and friendships. Her classmates remember small details that now feel painfully important. Some recall how she would greet people with a smile or stop to chat between classes. Others remember her as someone who seemed thoughtful, someone who carried herself with a maturity that stood out for her age. Like many teenagers, Iyana also thought about the future. She had dreams about what adulthood might bring: work, independence, and building a life of her own. Those dreams were still forming, still taking shape as she moved through her teenage years. But in the months leading up to her disappearance, Something in Iyana's life had changed in a way that only a few people knew about. She was pregnant. At just 16 years old, Iyana was 5 months into a pregnancy that had quietly altered the direction of her life. For a teenager, a pregnancy can bring complicated emotions: fear, hope, uncertainty, and the weight of decisions that feel overwhelming. Not everyone around her immediately knew about it. For some people in her life, the news came as a shock when it finally surfaced. Questions quickly followed. Who was the father? That answer was something Iyana had not openly shared with many people. The identity of the baby's father remained hidden from most of the people in her world. For those who knew she was expecting, the details about the relationship were still unclear. What investigators would eventually discover about that secret would change the direction of the entire case. Because when authorities finally uncovered the truth about who had fathered Iyana's unborn child, the investigation into her disappearance took a dark and deeply disturbing turn. When investigators began examining the people closest to Iyana Sawyer, one name quickly surfaced again and again: Jonathan Quiles. At first glance, Quiles was not someone who would normally draw suspicion. He was a grown man in his late 30s, living and working in Jacksonville. He was married, employed, and connected to Iyana through family ties. In fact, he was married to Iyana's aunt, which made him someone who had been welcomed into family gatherings and trusted around relatives. For years, he had been part of the extended family circle. That familiarity is what made the discovery investigators were about to make so disturbing. As detectives began reviewing messages, speaking with witnesses, and looking deeper into Iyana's personal life, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Iyana and Quiles had been involved in a secret relationship. According to prosecutors, this relationship began sometime before her disappearance, when Iyana was still a minor. The idea that a teenage girl and her adult uncle by marriage were involved in a relationship shocked everyone who learned about it. What appeared on the surface to be a trusted family connection was, according to the state, something very different behind closed doors. Situations like this often follow a pattern that experts describe as grooming. An adult builds trust with a younger person over time, gradually creating a relationship that feels personal and emotionally important to the teenager. The young person may believe the connection is genuine love, while the adult holds far more power and influence. In Iyana's case, prosecutors later argued that Quiles used that influence to maintain a secret relationship with her. The age difference alone created a significant imbalance. At 16, Iyana was still navigating adolescence, still learning about relationships, emotions, and trust. Quiles, on the other hand, was nearly 40 years old. For a teenager, attention from an adult can sometimes feel validating or exciting. When that attention is presented as affection or romantic interest, it can blur boundaries that should never be crossed. Investigators believe that over time, Quiles created a situation where Iyana felt emotionally attached to him. Because of the secrecy surrounding their relationship, only a very small number of people knew anything about it. Much of their communication happened privately. According to testimony presented in court, messages between them revealed a connection that had gone far beyond what anyone in the family suspected. At 5 months pregnant, the pregnancy was already well into its progression. For a teenager, this meant her life was about to change in ways she could never fully anticipate. The news of the pregnancy carried enormous consequences, not just for her, but for the man believed to be the father. If the truth about the pregnancy became public, it would expose everything: the secret relationship, the age difference, and the betrayal of family trust. Prosecutors argued that Quiles quickly realized how much he stood to lose. His marriage could collapse, his reputation could be destroyed, he could face serious criminal charges. Instead of preparing for the responsibilities that come with fatherhood, prosecutors say Quiles began pressuring Iyana to end the pregnancy. Witness testimony suggested that he urged her to get an abortion, but Iyana reportedly refused. For her, the baby may have represented something meaningful, perhaps hope, perhaps a sense of responsibility, or perhaps simply the belief that the child deserved a chance at life. That disagreement created a conflict that investigators later described as a turning point. On one side was a 16-year-old girl who was preparing to become a mother, On the other was an adult man whose entire life could collapse if the truth came out. As investigators reconstructed the events leading up to her disappearance, they began to believe that the pregnancy had become the central issue in the relationship. And when Iyana refused to end the pregnancy, prosecutors say the situation escalated. According to their theory, Quiles began considering a way to eliminate the problem entirely. The morning of December 19, 2018, began like any other weekday at Terry Parker High School in Jacksonville, Florida. Students arrived carrying backpacks, talking with friends, and settling into the normal routine of classes and hallway conversations. Among them was 16-year-old Iyana Sawyer. Nothing about the start of that day suggested it would end in tragedy. She moved through her morning schedule the same way she usually did, attending classes, speaking with classmates, and waiting for the lunch break that would give students a brief pause before the afternoon lessons began. At some point that morning, Iyana began communicating with someone on her phone. Messages were exchanged quietly, away from the attention of teachers and other students. To anyone nearby, it looked like the typical behavior of a teenager checking their phone during the school day. But those messages were part of a plan that would soon pull her away from campus. By midday, the lunch period had arrived. Students began filing out of classrooms, heading toward the cafeteria, gathering in small groups, or stepping outside to enjoy the break. Iyana left the building during this time. Security cameras around the school later captured moments of her movement through the campus. In the images, she could be seen carrying a couple of bags with her belongings inside. They weren't large, but they were noticeable enough that investigators later paid close attention to them. Those bags suggested she may have been preparing to go somewhere. She walked calmly across the grounds, moving toward the area where students sometimes met people picking them up. Her pace wasn't rushed. There was no sign of fear or hesitation. At that point, Iyana appeared to believe she was meeting someone she trusted. While walking toward the edge of campus, she looked down at her phone again. Another message appeared, a simple instruction. "Come outside, I'm here." Iyana continued toward the street where vehicles occasionally pulled up during lunch hours. Moments later, a car approached. The vehicle slowed and stopped near the curb. The driver leaned over, opening the passenger door from inside. For a brief moment, Iyana paused beside the car. Anyone watching might have assumed she knew the person behind the wheel. Then she stepped inside. The door shut. Within seconds, the vehicle pulled away from the school. Several people later recalled seeing the interaction. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. Students often leave campus with family members or acquaintances during lunch. But once Iyana failed to return to class, those small details suddenly became very important. Witnesses who had seen the pickup began speaking with investigators. When asked about the driver, some described the man who had been behind the wheel. The person who picked up Iyana that afternoon wasn't a stranger. It was someone connected to her family. Her uncle by marriage, Jonathan Quiles. At that moment, though, no one at the school knew what would follow. Teachers continued with afternoon lessons. Students moved through the rest of their schedules. But as the hours passed, something began to feel wrong. Iyana never returned to campus. Her seat in the classroom remained empty. Friends who expected to see her again that afternoon started to wonder where she had gone. At first, the absence didn't raise alarm. Sometimes students left school early for appointments or family matters. Yet as time moved forward and no one heard from her, concern began to grow. The girl who had walked calmly out of school during lunch had completely vanished. No phone calls, no messages, no explanation. But the most unsettling question remained unanswered. What had happened after she got into that car? Because what took place in the hours following that pickup would remain hidden from the public and from her family for a long time. And for investigators trying to uncover the truth, the events of that afternoon would remain a mystery for years. As the school day ended on December 19, 2018, students began leaving Terry Parker High School and heading home. For most families, it was just another ordinary afternoon. Parents expected their children to walk through the front door, drop their backpacks somewhere in the house, and talk about the day. But for Iyana Sawyer's family, that moment never came. Hours passed, and there was no sign of her. At first, her absence may not have seemed immediately alarming. Teenagers sometimes stay after school with friends, lose track of time, or make spontaneous plans. Families often assume there's a simple explanation. But as the evening continued and no one had heard from Iyana, concern began to grow. Phone calls were made to friends and classmates. Family members asked around, hoping someone had seen her or knew where she might be. Each call ended the same way. No one had information. Eventually, the situation became impossible to ignore. Iyana had not come home, and no one seemed to know where she was. Her family contacted authorities and reported her missing. Once the report was filed, officers began gathering the first pieces of information. In cases involving teenagers, investigators often consider several possibilities early on. One of the most common explanations is that the young person left voluntarily. Runaway cases are unfortunately not uncommon. Some teens leave home after arguments or stressful situations, believing they can handle life on their own for a while. Others may leave to spend time with friends or romantic partners without telling their families. Because of this, the early stages of many missing teen investigations involve determining whether the individual left by choice or whether something more serious has occurred. In Iyana's case, investigators initially explored the possibility that she had left willingly. After all, she had been seen leaving school during lunch. There was no immediate evidence of a struggle or forced abduction. Detectives began speaking with classmates, teachers, and family members to understand what had been happening in her life during the weeks leading up to her disappearance. They also started examining her phone activity. That is when they discovered messages that would become a crucial part of the investigation. Iyana had been communicating with Jonathan Quiles. The messages showed ongoing contact between the two around the time she left school. Investigators began reviewing the conversations, trying to determine what had been planned for that day. Detectives began reassessing every detail they had gathered so far. The messages, the pickup at the school, and the secret relationship now formed a troubling picture. The focus of the investigation began shifting toward the man who had last been seen with her. And from that moment forward, the case would take a completely different direction. According to prosecutors, the destination that day was a place connected directly to Jonathan Quiles' Ace Pick-a-Part. The business sat on a large stretch of land in Jacksonville and operated as an auto salvage yard. Rows of damaged vehicles filled the property, stacked and arranged across wide sections of open ground. Customers came to search for parts they could remove themselves, while employees worked among the metal frames and machinery throughout the day. But outside of working hours, the location could feel extremely quiet. The property was massive, spread across an area large enough that people in one section might not easily see activity happening somewhere else. There were countless vehicles, piles of metal, and narrow paths running between rows of cars. It was not the type of place where someone passing by on the street would notice much of anything happening deep inside the yard. Prosecutors believe that Quiles directed Iyana to meet him there on the day she disappeared. From her perspective, she likely believed she was meeting someone she trusted. The man waiting for her was someone she had been communicating with for months, someone she believed cared about her. Investigators later suggested that she may have thought they were about to leave Jacksonville together. The possibility of running away may have been discussed between them, especially given the difficult situation surrounding her pregnancy. For a 16-year-old facing an uncertain future, the idea of escaping with someone she trusted might have sounded like a solution. But authorities believe that when Iyana arrived at the junkyard, the situation unfolded very differently from what she expected. According to prosecutors, Quiles had not brought her there to begin a new life. They allege he brought her there to end one. At some point after she arrived on the property, prosecutors say Quiles shot Iyana. The exact details of that moment remain unclear because there were no witnesses to the act itself. What investigators were able to present in court came from evidence, statements, and testimony gathered during the years that followed. The state's theory was that after the shooting, Quiles attempted to hide what he had done. Prosecutors told the jury that he wrapped Iyana's body in a blanket. From there, they believe he placed her remains into a dumpster located on or near the property. Once the dumpster was collected by waste services, its contents would have been transported to a landfill. If that timeline is correct, it would explain one of the most heartbreaking parts of the case. Despite years of investigation and search efforts, Iyana Sawyer's body has never been found. For her family, that absence created an additional layer of grief. Without a recovered body, there was no burial, no physical place where loved ones could visit to mourn or say goodbye. All that remained were memories and unanswered questions. Search teams did examine landfill areas connected to the waste collection routes from the junkyard. These types of searches are extremely difficult. Landfills can cover enormous areas, and by the time investigators begin looking, countless tons of material may have already been moved or buried beneath additional layers of waste. Even with determined efforts, the chances of locating remains in those conditions become very small. The reality that Iyana's body might never be recovered has remained one of the most painful aspects of the case for those who loved her. It also meant that investigators had to rely heavily on other forms of evidence to determine what happened that day. The location of the meeting, the relationship between Iyana and Quiles, and the events leading up to her disappearance all became critical pieces of the case prosecutors would eventually present in court. But at the time investigators first began examining the junkyard connection, they still needed to prove exactly what had taken place there. And that meant building a case piece by piece. Before we continue, this case raises an important question. Looking at everything we know so far, do you think the warning signs could have been spotted earlier? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you're finding this story important and informative, take a moment to like the video. It really helps more people discover the channel and keeps these stories reaching a wider audience, because the next part of the investigation would bring forward new testimony and a revelation that pushed the case even closer to the truth. During the investigation and later testimony, Quiles' brother told authorities that Jonathan had admitted to killing Iyana. According to the brother, Quiles confessed the crime to him in a private conversation. Confessions made outside of a courtroom can carry enormous weight in a criminal investigation. When someone reveals details of a crime to another person, that testimony can become a crucial part of the evidence presented to a jury. For investigators, this statement helped strengthen the case they were building. It supported their theory about what had happened after Iyana left school that afternoon. With digital communication records, witness accounts, and testimony from within Quiles' own family, authorities believed they now had enough evidence to move forward. Eventually, Jonathan Quiles was arrested. He was formally charged with multiple crimes connected to Iyana Sawyer's disappearance and death. Among those charges were first-degree murder and sexual battery involving a minor. The arrest marked a major step toward justice for Iyana and her family. After years of searching for answers, the case was finally moving toward a courtroom. But an arrest is only the beginning of the legal process. The real fight over the truth of what happened to Iyana Sawyer was about to unfold, and the next stage of this case would play out where every piece of evidence would be examined in front of a jury. Because now, the real battle was about to begin. In court. When the case finally reached trial, the courtroom became the place where years of questions, grief, and investigation would be examined in detail. For Iyana Sawyer's family, it was the moment they had been waiting for, an opportunity for the truth about what happened to their daughter to be heard in front of a jury. Prosecutors opened their case by explaining the relationship between Iyana and Jonathan Quiles. They told the jury that the evidence would show how a secret relationship between a 16-year-old girl and her uncle, by marriage, led to a pregnancy that Quiles believed would expose everything. According to the prosecution, that pregnancy was the central motive for the crime. They argued that Quiles understood the consequences he could face if the truth came out. The relationship itself was illegal because of Iyana's age. If people discovered he had fathered her unborn child, prosecutors said his marriage would likely collapse and he could face serious criminal charges. Instead of taking responsibility for the situation, prosecutors argued that Quiles made a decision that ended 2 lives. Because Iyana's body had never been recovered, the prosecution relied heavily on testimony, digital communication records, and statements from people who had knowledge of the relationship. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Quiles' own brother testified. On the stand, he told the court that Jonathan had admitted the killing to him. According to his testimony, Quiles confessed that he shot Iyana and disposed of her body afterward. The courtroom fell silent as the testimony was delivered. For the prosecution, this confession helped strengthen their argument that Quiles had committed the crime and attempted to hide it. The defense, however, pushed back against the state's claims. Defense attorneys emphasized that no physical remains had been recovered and argued that the prosecution's case depended largely on statements and assumptions about what might have happened. They questioned the reliability of witness testimony and suggested that the evidence did not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional impact of the case was felt by everyone present. At one point, a member of Iyana's family spoke about the teenager they had lost. The relative described her as a young girl who had her entire future ahead of her. A daughter and family member whose life ended before she had the chance to grow into adulthood or raise the child she was carrying. The words brought visible emotion into the courtroom. For the jury, the case was now in their hands. After closing arguments, they left the courtroom to deliberate. The decision would determine whether prosecutors had proven their case. When the jury returned, the courtroom grew quiet as the verdict was read. Jonathan Quiles was found guilty. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder for the killing of Iyana Sawyer and the murder of her unborn child. For Iyana's family, the verdict delivered a measure of justice. But even with that decision, one painful truth remained. Her body had never been found, and the final resting place of the 16-year-old girl they loved was still unknown. Jonathan Quiles stood before the court after being found guilty of first-degree murder and the murder of Iyana's unborn child. The crimes he had been convicted of carried the most severe penalties under the law. The judge ultimately sentenced him to multiple life sentences in prison. For prosecutors and investigators who had worked the case for years, the sentence marked the conclusion of a long legal battle. The verdict meant that Quiles would spend the rest of his life behind bars, held accountable for the deaths of both Iyana and the child she had been carrying. But for Iyana's family, the moment was far more complicated. A conviction can bring justice, but it cannot bring back the person who was lost. The young girl they loved was still gone, and the reality of that loss continued to affect their lives every day. Iyana Sawyer's body has never been recovered. Without a burial site, the family has no place to visit where they can physically honor her memory. There is no gravesite where flowers can be placed, no headstone marking the place where she rests. Instead, they live with unanswered questions about what happened in the final moments of her life. That absence has become one of the most heartbreaking parts of the case. Justice was delivered in a courtroom, but closure remains far more complicated. For the people who loved Iyana, the loss is permanent, and the search for peace continues long after the legal process ended. One of the most critical issues in this case was the dynamic between a minor and an adult in a position of trust. When an adult forms a secret relationship with a teenager, there is often a significant imbalance of power. Young people are still developing emotionally and may not fully recognize when they are being manipulated or pressured. In many situations involving exploitation, the relationship begins with what appears to be harmless attention. Over time, boundaries slowly shift. The adult may create emotional dependence, presenting themselves as someone the young person can rely on or trust above others. Secrecy becomes a key part of this process. The teenager may be encouraged to keep the relationship hidden from parents, friends, or other adults. Once secrecy takes hold, it becomes easier for the situation to continue without anyone intervening. This is why open communication within families is so important. Teenagers should feel safe discussing their relationships, concerns, and experiences without fear of punishment or judgment. When young people believe they can speak honestly with the adults in their lives, it becomes easier for warning signs to be noticed early. Communities and schools also play an important role in protecting young people. Teachers, relatives, and mentors are often in positions where they may notice unusual behavior or concerning relationships. Taking those concerns seriously can make a difference. Iyana's case reminds us that exploitation does not always come from strangers. Sometimes, it comes from people who have already gained a family's trust. Iyana Sawyer was only 16 years old. She was still a student, still discovering who she would become, still standing at the beginning of adulthood. Like many teenagers, she had dreams about what her future might hold. That future was taken away before it had the chance to unfold. She never had the opportunity to graduate, pursue a career, or build the life she might have imagined for herself. She never had the chance to experience the milestones that most people take for granted: growing older, starting a family, and creating memories that stretch across decades. And the child she was carrying never had the chance to enter the world. When people hear true crime stories, it is easy to focus on the investigation, the courtroom arguments, and the verdict. But behind every case is a real person whose life mattered to those who loved them. Remembering victims like Iyana helps ensure that their stories are not forgotten. And if stories like this matter to you, and you want more true crime investigations like this one, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. Also, tell me in the comments what case you think we should cover next.